64 days and 2,340 miles after leaving Southampton, we had brought Venture 2 to Iceland by way of Scotland and the Faroe Islands. From our base in Reykjavik, we hired a car and set out to explore the country. Many imagine much of Iceland to consist of volcanoes belching steam and ash, but in reality, the valleys are filled with lush and beautiful farms. Although not originally native to Iceland, lupins are early colonizers of less fertile areas. Icelandic horses are unique in that they have 5 gaits instead of the usual 4. In AD 982, a law was passed forbidding the import of horses into the country, so the breed has remained pure for over 1,000 years. The best way to see the country is to head off the beaten track. For good reason, most routes are designated for 4-wheel drive only, and there are stiff penalties for venturing on them with a conventional vehicle. There are plenty of rivers to ford, and we rented a small 4-wheel drive Suzuki, which served us well. Wildflowers gain a tenuous foothold among volcanic rocks. The star-shaped leaves are young lupins. Lava fields are frequently cloaked with strange velvety moss. Fast-flowing streams carry silt from upstream before leaping over cliffs in a series of wonderful waterfalls. The largest in the south is the mighty Dettifoss. Near the town of Vik, meaning harbour, fields of wild lupins reach out towards bizarre rock formations. These, along with black beeches and fleshy angelica, bring to mind scenes from Jurassic Park. The church at Vik looked very different just 3 months earlier, when this area caught the edge of the fallout from the volcanic eruption. We saw plenty of evidence of the chaos wrought by the volcano, and we headed into the affected areas to see some of the destruction for ourselves. There were many streams and rivers to ford, and a modest breeze lifted the fine volcanic dust from the surface, reducing visibility to almost zero.
This is fun. It's dust somewhere behind you. Somewhere wherever you feel comfortable staying.
ash had the gritty consistency of carborundum, but was as fine as talc, making it hard to follow the track and eventually forcing us to turn back.
Guess what? Oh, I can't see
Work was still in progress to repair the levees, which had been swept away by snowmelt from the volcanic fires. Glacier walks are among the many opportunities for exploration in a monochrome landscape which oftentimes resembled the surface of the moon. In Geysir, steam floats above the wildflowers and boiling water bubbles from the ground. All other geysers, or geysers depending on your pronunciation, are named after the original, which sadly now has gone quiet, leaving the main attraction to Strucker, which shoots skyward every 5 minutes or so. Other volcanic curiosities closer to Reykjavik include the famous Blue Lagoon, which even on an overcast rainy day still managed to appear blue. But it was time for us to leave Reykjavik and head up the west coast towards Olafsvik on the next leg of our circumnavigation of Iceland. It was a beautiful day when we took our leave. A small flotilla of locals went bobbing by as we passed through the harbour entrance. Just Chris and myself were on board for this leg of the trip. The Snaefeld's ice cap was prominent on the horizon, while still 50 miles distant. We turned into Olafsvik harbour, which was very commercial, and tied up against a wall of tires for which there was no charge. We left the following day under a lowering sky. We were soon passing the Latrabrag cliffs, 14 kilometers long and 1,465 feet high. This was the most westerly point of our trip. In 1947, local farmers rescued all 12 crew members from a wrecked British trawler by lowering themselves on ropes and hauling them 680 feet up the cliffs. Headlands are a magnet for rough seas, and we found ourselves battling waves equaling those we had experienced on our approach to Iceland. But this time it was only for 3 hours, and we were more accustomed to the conditions. This was normal weather for boats much smaller in size than Venture. Towering mountains plummeted into the turbulent sea. U-shaped glaciated valleys were often home to a single isolated structure. The way into Voltner Fjord is eased by range markers on the shore. The harbour is protected by a sandbank which almost closes off the fjord, making it very secure. Seaweed prevented the anchor from holding, and the only place we could find to tie up was alongside a fishing trawler, for which we obtained permission. Fulmars were busy gleaning what they could from the nearby waters. We were now further north in Fairbanks in Alaska. When we left the following morning, the stack from an abandoned Norwegian whaling station stood out on the horizon. There are several of these discarded structures around the coast, and all that is left is a tall chimney and rusted boilers along the bleak shoreline. Once out of the protection of the fjord, we were again exposed to the rough conditions in the Davis Strait, dividing Iceland from Greenland. Conditions calmed as soon as we began our approach into Isafjorda. The town, huddling at the base of huge mountains, is the jumping-off spot for boats heading to Greenland. We were allocated a place on the floating pontoon, which was a rare treat in this part of the world. Isafjorda is served by an airport, and we were joined here by David, who had flown out from England. The rough conditions had scrambled the chain, and we used this opportunity to clear the jumble. There was a strong wind and the weather was cold. Greenland was only 130 miles away, and to the north there is nothing between here and the pole. A severe weather system with the lowest pressure for 10 years was forecast, and we were lucky to be moored in such a snug location. Gulls hung on the strong wind blowing 30 knots even within the inner harbour. Venture 2 was a heavy boat for the small pontoon, and Chris added extra lines from the nearby jetty to relieve the load. The wind was still strong when, after a delay of a couple of days, we got underway and passed the hanging valley that overlooks the town. The skyline was dominated by the shimmering Dranga ice cap. We were heading for Hornstrandir, the most remote area in all of Iceland, where there are no settlements, no roads, and no communications. Our immediate destination was the unsurveyed and uncharted fjord of Longafjordur, which had been recommended to us by a local yachtsman. The magic of Google Earth allows us to make a virtual flight up the fjord, but the real-world version was a place of pristine beauty, untarnished by the hand of man. A major waterfall at the head of the fjord filled the air with a soothing lullaby. As soon as the anchor was down, we launched the tender to see a diminutive venture dwarfed by the grandeur of her surroundings. That evening we celebrated with an excellent dinner of roast pork served with wine. As evening approached, the skies began to clear, and a lingering sunset, here filmed at midnight, settled its silent wings over the fjord. The following morning dawned clear and absolutely calm. Large numbers of beautiful jellyfish trailed their delicate tentacles through the pellucid water. We retrieved the anchor using the built-in nozzle to wash the chain. My solo excursion in the tender along the full length of the fjord to film Venture in her natural environment was a thrilling ride of sheer exhilaration, never to be forgotten. We ducked into another branch of the fjords where we encountered the only other cruising yacht we had met underway. Here was a scattering of buildings catering to hikers. Along the shore, the remains of another abandoned whaling station. We continued north along the rugged, uninhabited coast. This small structure is one of a series of refuge huts, marked here in red on this map. This beacon marked our furthest point from Southampton, about 1,550 miles as the crow flies, and just over 100 miles from Greenland. It would have been perfect weather to make the 12-hour crossing, but alas, we had to press on. We passed a series of towering cliffs, each home to countless numbers of seabirds. The shoreline in Holmvik Bay was littered with driftwood, which had, amazingly, originated in Siberia and reached these shores by way of the polar ice. This headland is the northern Cape Horn, and these cliffs, also home to millions of birds, drop vertically 1,760 feet sheer into the Greenland Sea. We were now only a couple of miles south of the Arctic Circle, and 3 weeks past the summer solstice. In a glow that never faded from the sky, a delicate sunset morphed into a matching sunrise, with the orb of the sun skimming the horizon. As the sun rose higher above the burnished surface of the sea, its golden rays painted the peaks of the nearby mountains. We headed south, 40 miles down the long fjord leading to Akureyri. This attractive city, lying in the shadow of the mountains, is the capital of the north, and Venture was allocated a convenient berth, right in the city centre. This is a port of call for cruise ships, one of which is seen here beyond the local boat club. Akureyri is surrounded by lush farmland with many horses. Haymaking was in full swing, and fields were dotted with white bales resembling giant marshmallows. In boggy areas, the fluffy heads of cotton grass nod and flutter in the breeze. We hired a car and toured this part of the country. We visited the fishing harbour of Olaf Fjord. Local gulls clearly believed that the catch was for their benefit, but no one seemed to think it was worth the hassle of driving them away. En route to Lake Maivatten, we visited Dettifoss, into which, legend has it, a local chieftain threw his pagan gods when he converted to Christianity in AD 1000. Just north of the lake is a vast volcanic area where steam hisses out of the ground and mud pots bubble and spurt. Close by, thermal energy has been harnessed to generate electricity. Steam roars out of the vents. This monster could be heard 3 miles away. The human figure on the hill gives scale to this explosion crater. Fields of frozen lava stretch to the horizon, and we meander through an active volcanic area where wisps of steam rise all around. We now headed 40 miles offshore to remote Grimsey Island. Only 2 miles in area, with just 100 inhabitants, its main claim to fame is that it lies on the Arctic Circle. We arrived over a weekend so that we could tie up at the ferry terminal. The tiny harbour is built like a fortress against the fury of the ocean. Most of the male population came to look at adventure, and one kindly offered to drive us around the island. Our first stop was the marker for the Arctic Circle. Our guide is on the right, with Chris and crew members Brian and Val, who had joined us from Vancouver. All along the shore was more driftwood from Siberia, and at last we were able to see close up the puffins who had been eluding us at every stage of our journey. These comical little birds live in burrows in the ground. Our guide then led us by the hand part way down the cliffs to what he called a secret place. The following day we circumnavigated the island so we could observe these same cliffs from the sea. One of the fishermen was very insistent we took him along. We crossed the Arctic Circle, which is generally considered 66 degrees 33 minutes. He was also very keen to take the helm. After dropping him back at the harbour, we continued on our way. This church on Grimsey was built using driftwood. We entered the busy and attractive town of Husavik and picked our place to tie up. As usual, someone appeared out of the blue to take our lines. Husavik is a centre for whale watching, and many traditional boats filled the harbour. But sadly, we did not see any whales. We had been told in Grimsey that the warming ocean temperatures had caused them to move further north. From here we drove to Dettifoss, billed as the most powerful waterfall in Europe. Its waters were grey with sediment from the glacier which fed it. Slightly downstream were a pair of smaller falls which anywhere else would have been major attractions in their own right. Back at sea we rounded the northeast tip of Iceland and once again crossed the Arctic Circle, this time slightly north of our previous position. We celebrated the occasion by adding champagne to our orange juice.
Thank you. Juice and champagne.
From now on, we would be heading south all the way back to Southampton. We visited Voltner Fjord, where we passed a large fishing trawler on our way into the harbour. The chief engineer and two others came to call on us after we tied up and invited us to visit their ship, which we were delighted to do. The following day we continued south into Fjord, our last fjord and final port before leaving Iceland. Fjord is the destination for the weekly car ferry between Iceland and Scandinavia. So if you bring your own vehicle to Iceland, this is the port at which you will arrive. The ferry only stayed a few hours. This is a ship which has to cope with some tough sea conditions. The season was advancing, and we had to be back in Southampton by the end of August, in time for the International Boat Show. We topped up our fuel from a tanker truck, which had brought fuel over the mountains from the next fjord. We headed out into the North Atlantic for the 500-mile crossing direct to Scotland. Time to go is shown on the plotter as 2.2 days. Total time taken for the trip to and from Southampton was 134 days, during which we had covered 4,677 nautical miles.